Therapy Chat Podcast, episode 160.
This is the Therapy Chat Podcast with Laura Reagan, LCSWC. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, LCSWC.
Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. As you're listening to this, I am away on vacation. It's the week of Thanksgiving, and I am taking some much needed time to rest and recover. I know it probably seems like I go away a lot if you notice that I'm always at trainings and conferences and things like that, but that's not really restful. That's still working, and I work a lot. So as I've mentioned before, my body has been telling me that I need to slow down. So I'm slowing down. I'm going on vacation. But this episode is 2 previous episodes of interviews with Kyle Davies, the founder of Energy Flow Coaching and the author of The Intelligent Body. You're going to hear my newest interview with Kyle next week. So I wanted to give you a preview, a prequel. Not really. So I wanted to refresh your memory by bringing back episodes 110 and 115, in which Kyle talked about how our emotions relate to our health and chronic illness and chronic pain, and how they can be relieved with getting connected back to your true self. So he talked about that in those 2 episodes, which you're going to hear combined into one for episode 160. And then in episode 161, you'll hear my most recent interview with Kyle when he was visiting the U.S. last week, a couple weeks ago now. Anyway, I hope you have a restful week as well, and I will be back with a new episode the week of November 26, 2018. Until then, take care, and thanks for listening to Therapy Chat. Therapy Chat Podcast wouldn't exist without the support of its listeners. If you'd like to become a member, please go to patreon.com/therapychat. By making a $1 per month donation, you can help Therapy Chat keep going over the long haul. Thank you for your support. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. Today, I'm so excited to share this fascinating conversation that I'm about to have with my guest today, Kyle Davies. Kyle, thanks so much for being on Therapy Chat today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Laura. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. As you can all hear, Kyle is calling in from Wales, which is wonderful. I'm so grateful that you are willing to be interviewed on Therapy Chat all the way from Wales about your book, The Intelligent Body, Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out. So Kyle, let's just start off by you telling our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your work.
I guess I could tell you how I arrived at where I am now, if that's any use. So I'm a psychologist by original trade, and I started my career in management consulting, doing a whole range of different things. The thing that sort of interested me most was the coaching, counselling in the workplace with execs. One of the things about that was that I kind of felt that people were operating within a role, and I just wanted to get a little bit deeper. So I went and trained in a variety of different things, from Ericksonian psychotherapy, NLP, bit of CBT, some counselling, some tapping, a whole variety of things. And then I started working as a therapist then, as a part-time therapist in 1999. And I was playing from a cognitive perspective, really, with anxiety, depression, and sort of stressy stuff. And in 2002, I then was introduced to a Scottish medical doctor, and he'd done some of the same therapy training as I had. And his reasons were that his girlfriend at the time had chronic fatigue syndrome, And as a medical doctor, he was deeply frustrated because there was nothing that he could do for her. And, as we know, doctors can be a bit arrogant. And he thought, well, I should be able to do something for her, but I don't seem to be able to. So he did some therapy trainings, some of the same stuff that I had done. And he was playing around with the ideas, seeing his patients in a separate clinic, and was beginning to notice that, he was making some difference to them, to their symptoms. So I started working with him. We developed the ideas. We trained some therapists. This was, as I say, sort of 2002, 2003. And at that time, we thought, this is great. We're going to be rich and famous now because there is nothing out there for people with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and all those medically unexplained symptoms. But we were wrong. And the reason we were wrong was because what was at the root of our work was emotion and emotional stress. And of course, the majority of people still really look at the mind and body as separate. So people often in quite a hostile way would say, how can you possibly say that you can help us? You're a psychologist, you're talking about emotion. I've got a physical illness, I've got physical symptoms. What can you possibly do? So it's, I guess, understandably to a certain extent, because we are seeing more and more people with medically unexplained symptoms of fatigue and pain, headaches, migraines, and stomach problems, and these sorts of things, and insomnia. So, and a lot of the time, I guess, because these are medically unexplained, when they come to be diagnosed as chronic fatigue or adrenal fatigue or fibromyalgia, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So essentially meaning that medicine can't find anything wrong with you. So if your symptoms persist and they're clustered in this way, we're offering you this diagnosis. And I think that there's a deep frustration among many of these sufferers, understandably so, because they feel that they've been let down by medicine, because medicine was kind of the view that, well, maybe if we don't know what it is, it doesn't exist. So I think us coming along and saying it's about emotion, or largely about that, or it plays a huge role, and the mind-body split paradigm still being very evident, that made our progress a little slower than we hoped. So interesting, actually, it's amazing how hard it is to have research done. I tried very hard talking to a variety of academics about having research done of the work, and I spoke to one professor in the university reasonably close to me, and he said, I think you've got something here. This is a great idea. He said, but what you'll find in the UK, he said, there's no money for research for new ideas such as this, particularly a therapy. He said, your best bet would be to do a part-time PhD for 6 years, and then we could hope that we could get some interest for some funding then. I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? But my business partner, the doctor, kind of got a bit jaded really with the idea that we weren't making as much progress as he wanted, and because we were unable to get research done, we remained in the private healthcare sector rather than being kind of embraced within kind of mainstream. And that meant we had to be in business. And as a medical doctor, he was only interested in kind of working with patients. He wasn't interested in being in business. So I've continued the work, and obviously now written this book, The Intelligent Body, which came out a couple of months ago. And yes, what's interesting to me now, I think, is that there are, I think back in 2002, I don't recall there being any other treatment programs, but there seem to be quite a few that have come to the surface now since, and there seems to be increasing acceptance of the idea of emotional stress and physical injury. So that's a little bit about me in the background. Was that what you wanted?
Yes. Thank you. That's wonderful. And, I'm thinking what you're saying about research, that if there isn't a medical solution, for example, a pill or, a surgery or some type of medical treatment for the issue, then no one wants to fund it, because it's so often the pharmaceutical companies that are funding this type of research. Not always, but
it's not good for business otherwise, is it?
Right. Because if the answer is in emotion, unless it involves prescribing antidepressants, but really even then, antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications may help with the most acute symptoms. But when the issue is within the person, it's more about resolving the issue within the person than masking the symptoms with a medication. Are we in agreement about that?
Oh, no, we are, absolutely. And I think what's interesting here is that in Wales, and I think the UK as well, the prescriptions for antidepressants have doubled in the last 6 years. So what we're experiencing is that, and there's a whole host of reasons for that, which we can go into if you want to. But obviously, from my perspective, it's good for business, but it doesn't solve the problem.
No, exactly.
So what we're seeing, is and what I see an awful lot of is clients on 12 or 15 tablets, and they don't really know what they are. But what they know is they're taking this tablet for maybe their pain, but they think they're taking this one for the side effects of this one, and before they know it, their house looks like a drugstore. And yeah, it's in the long term, it's not solving the problem.
Right. It's treating the symptoms rather than the underlying issue.
Yeah. But that's kind of what medicine does, doesn't it? Medicine does some fantastic things, but it has a focus on treating symptoms. And it in many instances, doesn't have time to ask the question. And arguably, the pharmaceutical industries are not necessarily interested, arguably, in the cause anyway, because, it is better for business if you're treating symptoms, and if people are taking statins for life, that's better than them taking them for 6 weeks and then stopping.
Certainly. Yeah. So you talked in your book about in the beginning of the book, you talked about how you heard about a link between anger and heart disease, and then about prostate cancer and stress. Can you talk about how the stress response happens in the body? Because you mentioned adrenal fatigue, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and also irritable bowel syndrome you talked about in the book, these clusters of symptoms that there's really, again, you can only treat the symptoms in medicine, but there's no real medical reason that can be identified. And people get really frustrated with that idea that, oh, it's all in my head, or I don't like being told that this is just emotional because it means that, I need to get it together. That's certainly the American way. And I think, typical of.
That's absolutely right, isn't it? I think so. There's probably a couple of points. The first thing in terms of mind and body, I think, one of the ways that we can see that mind and body are connected is through stress. And stress, like emotion, conjures up ideas for people. And those ideas are often probably a little bit further from the truth than they'd like to believe. So people often think that stress is that nervous, agitated feeling that they have if their boss is shouting at them. But I would say, well, that's an emotional feeling. So if you're aware that you feel uncomfortable, that's feeling feedback. Now, it may be that your body is in a state of stress with cortisol, adrenaline and whatnot coursing your veins, but it may not be. It may be that you're just feeling emotional feelings. So the two things about stress I think are important are, firstly, that our body can be in a state of stress or the stress response without us being consciously aware of that, which I think that's that's extremely interesting. And I think I mentioned this in the book that years ago I read a book by the psychiatrist Dr. David Servan-Schreiber called Healing Without Prozac and Freud, and he talks about an experiment where he's measuring the emotional activity within the brain when people were observing something kind of disturbing. So we had his subjects watch a disturbing film, and then he was measuring, I think, their heart rate, the blood pressure, and the activity of the emotional brain. And he said they had one lady in, and she was watching this video, and he was looking at her, the readings, and he said her heart rate was going high, her blood pressure was kind of sky high, and the activity of her emotional brain was kind of going bonkers. And he was thinking, oh my God, this lady is in a deep state of stress. I better go and check she's okay. So he goes into the lab and he says, are you okay? Do you want me to turn this film off? And she looks at him with an element of surprise and says, oh no, I'm perfectly fine. I'm quite happy watching this. Now, his argument was, well, she's not an emotionally intelligent person. She's not aware of what's going on. I would say, well, this is a great example how we can be kind of locked out of our feeling senses and how our body can be in a deep state of stress without us being consciously aware of it. And I go on to say, well, yeah, if for that particular lady, there's every chance that at some point that she could develop symptoms because she isn't aware when her body is in this state of stress. So that's the first thing I think is important. This is stress is something that is a response in the body, and we don't have to be aware of it. The second important thing I think about stress, or the stress response, is that it's pretty much the same, apparently, regardless of whether the trigger is an emotional trauma, a physical injury, or an illness. So, you could be hit over the head with a frying pan, you could have a bad case of flu, or you could have a relationship breakup, and the stress response in the body is exactly the same. So, as you've seen, Laura, in my book, I like to kind of, when I've been working with clients, I like to try to make things super simple. So I kind of talk about it in terms of a stress bucket, and with the idea being that when our stress bucket is full, we tend to get symptoms. But I'm looking at, rather than it just being our emotional stress or emotion that gets locked up in that stress bucket, it can be things like if you have a bad diet, if you're drinking too much, if you're over exercising, if you're not sleeping, if you've had an accident, if you've had an illness. I mean, last year I had a couple of clients that started with me, and they said to me that they both had fibromyalgia, and they said that their fibromyalgia was caused by a car accident. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was, the car accident was sort of the final straw, if you will. So my sense of it was, well, what we're looking at is a reasonably full stress bucket. The body is already kind of reasonably stressed, and this is the final piece that kind of pushes them over the edge. So the way I look at it in terms of, I kind of going back to your question, is how stress manifests. I see it as a bit of a chain reaction, really, that when our stress bucket is full, which for me a lot of it is a buildup of emotional stress, I think that emotional stress leads probably to a rewiring of the emotional midbrain, which is the HPA axis, which I think then causes irregularity within the nervous system, the immune system, the endocrine system. And then what we get from there is a diverse range of symptoms. Because what we're used to experiencing is that medicine or treatments either work on the symptoms, or maybe they try to balance the systems of the body, where my sense is what we need to do is say, well, there's every chance that this chain reaction is taking place. So we need to come right back and look at the original source, which is the stress. And I think, the biggest piece is the emotional stress. And I do recognize, well, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because that's what I work with. But I think, if you've had a car accident, that's a one-off. If you've had surgery, that's a one-off. If you've had a bad case of flu, well, yeah, that you can move past that. But usually with the emotion, from my perspective, it's a drip feed. And I think the other kind of bit that sort of goes to that, and do stop me if I'm talking too much, is that, again, I think, and this is coming from the work of Antonio Damasio, and he suggests that emotions and feelings are slightly different things, and the structures in the brain involved in producing them are slightly different. And he suggests that emotion is a non-conscious process that is supposed to trigger feelings. So we have emotional feelings. The thing that's important for me about that is that what we know is that it's possible for us to block our feelings. So that lady in the experiment was if there were the presence of any feelings of increased heart rate, all that, it's possible for us to tune out of feelings. So, anger, fear, sadness, all that. It is possible for us to tune out and therefore not feel them. And I think what happens is that even if we can suppress our feelings, the emotions, because they're non-conscious, they're still there. So they're still kind of going on in the background.
Yeah, exactly.
But, and I think what happens is that it's almost as if our body uses emotional feelings, just like it uses hunger, just like it uses tiredness, as a feedback mechanism to get our attention. It uses, even though emotion is more complex, it uses emotion or emotional feelings as a feedback. And I think that what happens is that if that emotion, if those feelings become blocked, it's almost as if the body decides it's got to find some way of getting that message through. So it begins to send symptoms. And that's when people experience what I think is obviously a diverse range from anxiety, depression, through to migraines, insomnia. And it could be, as we were talking before the show, the work of Gabor Mate. He'll talk about cancer, heart disease, arthritis, all these sorts of things. So, it's some people are skeptical of these ideas, but I think that it's certainly interesting. And I guess I look at, when it comes to chronic, if anyone's experiencing a chronic health challenge, I don't, and this is, I suppose, where the simple idea of the stress bucket comes in. I don't think, even though we like to think of things as that causes, this causes that, my sense is there probably isn't a single primary cause. My sense is it's probably a little bit more like a combination lock. So between your environment, your genes, your upbringing, your current emotion, your diet, your life, all of those things factor in. And I think when all of the numbers of the combination lock are lined up, the lock shuts, and then you get symptoms. So I've forgotten what your question was now. My ramblings.
No, you answered it. In a way, I asked you to talk about the stress response. So I think that your answer was wonderful. And if you will, I'd like to talk a little more about that, even because you talk about and you mentioned the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I'm really curious about this. You say in the book, I'm going to read a little part. It says, short-term stress, which can trigger the fight or flight response in the body, is not problematic and does not negatively impact the body and brain. However, when the body remains in a state of stress, the adrenal glands release the stress hormones cortisol, epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and norepinephrine. These stress hormones course through your veins, affecting your blood vessels en route to your heart. And you talked about, over time, if the stress response remains switched on, these chemical changes can cause structural damage. I'm really interested in that because, that seems to me to be the link between the ACEs study that you and I were talking about, Dr. Filitti's work and from Kaiser Permanente, and the physical pain symptoms, disease, the shorter lifespan and the stomach problems. Like, I'm really curious about that HPA axis and what role that plays. And I don't know, so maybe you do.
Well, okay. So there's a couple of points. I suppose the first point is, in terms of how much do we know? I remember last year, the year before, talking to an academic who worked at the time for the National Institute of Health over in Washington, D.C. And I was explaining this to her because I was saying, could it be that there's overactivity in the HPA axis? Could it be the hypothalamus is in overdrive? So the hypothalamus gland is a little bit like the master gland. It's a little bit like the captain of the ship, where it's overseeing everything to do with survival, our blood pressure, our heart rate, our water intake, our food intake, our sexual behavior, our response to heat and all that kind of stuff. And it's overseeing everything, and it gets signals in from the body and then sends signals out to the body through the pituitary gland to have the body kind of do stuff. And what happens when symptoms are occurring, the hypothesis is that the hypothalamus gland and, through the pituitary and the adrenals then become somewhat overactive. The only thing is that we don't actually have a way of measuring this. So I was explaining this. I said, well, could it be that those midbrain regions, the amygdala as well, could they be overactive? Can we measure that? And she was saying, well, I'm not sure that in terms of the level of detail that you're talking about, whether at the moment we can measure that to see whether they are actually overactive. I guess in terms of the output, we probably can. So somebody with adrenal fatigue, there's every chance that their cortisol levels are absolutely on the floor, because they've had so much secreted into the system that it's kind of on its back. So I guess in terms of output, you can measure, but it's also as well in terms of, I guess we're looking at symptoms and the fact that, certainly when it comes to things like chronic fatigue and pain, as I say, this and the sorts of symptoms that I've been working with is that they're diagnosed through exclusion, as I was saying earlier. So the symptoms are present, and people with these symptoms are not making them up, but medicine up to this point has not been able to find anything that's wrong. So there's got to be kind of something that's going on somewhere. So the idea being, I guess, that if the symptoms are present, it's almost as if the body is acting as if there's something wrong. So that idea of the hypothalamus being the captain of the ship is, if that captain of the ship believes there to be something wrong, then he's sending signals out. If he thinks that there's a hole in the side of the ship, he's probably sending everyone, you've got to get down to that area of the boat, you've got to work really hard. So it's almost like that's happening. The body is acting as if there is something wrong, but there's no external invader. So, for example, if you were to have a case of flu, a flu virus enters your system, your immune system acts, and cells are sent to attack the virus. The virus kind of bursts. It will then trigger the hypothalamus into a temporary overdrive state, and of course all the symptoms that we experience of a runny nose, swollen glands, sore throat, all of those are as a result of our body responding to there being a problem, and it's trying to kill this invader. And of course the symptoms are temporary, because once that invading pathogen has been killed, the hypothalamus and the HPA axis go back to normal functioning. The kind of idea with stress, as you were just reading that passage, is that sometimes we can be aware if we're in that fight or flight mode. And I guess the idea is, and it's almost a bit of a cliche now, the idea of, well, if, back in the olden days, if we were being chased by a bear in the forest, and, initially we spot the bear, the body moves into fight or flight, we run like crazy, we escape the bear or get eaten. But if we escape the bear, at some point later, we come out of fight or flight and we go back to normal functioning. Sort of the kind of idea really is, with my work, is that probably what we're experiencing is a lot of low-level stresses that we're not aware of. And as a result of that, the stress response, and because the stress response can be on without us being aware of it, is that the stress response stays on, and then after a period of time, the body begins to break down. So, does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'm fascinated by the gut health piece and IBS. I mean, my clients, pretty much almost all of my clients have childhood trauma and attachment trauma, and so many of them have IBS or, other stomach issues. So can you talk about the inflammatory response and how that relates to health?
I think so. The sort of the root of me touching on the gut microbiome is that what I've witnessed is over the kind of years of doing this is that certainly over the last 5 years, there has been this surge of interest in nutrition. And it seems to be the case that there are lots of people that seem to be believing that, well, if I get my nutrition sorted, my health will be absolutely fine. And, people are talking about depression, anxiety, it all starts in the gut. So, and I guess I found this a bit frustrating, really, having worked with people with chronic health problems and seeing how they'd done a lot of work on their diet and still they were presenting lots of symptoms. So my knowledge about it is rudimentary. There's also the kind of idea, well, everything comes from inflammation as well. And I think what seems to be being uncovered is that we have a nervous system, the enteric nervous system within the gut, and so there are neurons within the gut, and therefore when we have a gut feeling, that comes from the flow of intelligent activity within the gut. But there is this the flow of information and channels run between the gut microbiome and the brain. So the gut does affect the brain, and the brain affects the gut, and the kind of heart plays a role in that as well. So this is why it can be the case that if you have a bad gut, an upset stomach, that can affect your brain. So there is that theory that, well, anxiety can arise from problems in your digestive system, which arguably could be the truth. I suppose my sense of it is that because of the connection between brain and gut microbiome, it's probably more likely the case that our emotion is affecting our gut through our nervous system.
I think so too.
So, and again, I would say, well, the caveat to that is that I'm coming from this perspective. My work is based on that. But as I say, I guess because this idea of emotion and stress leading to chronic health challenges and is reasonably new, certainly in terms of doing something about it or having a treatment for it, most of the people that I see and have seen over the last 15 years will have tried a truckload of things first. And nutritional programs is something that most people have tried. And whilst there may be some benefit, it doesn't get, in my experience, it doesn't get people better.
Yes. And, I think what you said before about how there are so many variables involved, to me, it's not your gut causes anxiety. I think it's a reciprocal. It goes both ways. It's not a one-way gut to brain. It's brain to gut, gut to brain, heart, all of the
circular
systems.
Causality, really, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Not a one thing. But, for me, it seems like stress, as you mentioned, and in my world, childhood trauma is a theme that you can almost find in almost everyone who has, physical health symptoms. But that's a little bit maybe of an overgeneralization.
I think it's absolutely true because, one of the interesting things that I found with people that I've worked with is that obviously I always ask for a history of symptoms. And if I'm working with somebody with IBS, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or adrenal fatigue, they'll say, well, I had my diagnosis 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. And when we track back, kind of more medically unexplained symptoms, they always go back to kind of usually childhood. And there's always a variety of things that have happened in their childhood. So my experience is childhood trauma, in a broad way, is always playing a role.
Well, I love that you said that because that's really what I think too. But I think that one of the problems in that statement for a lot of people possibly who are listening or people we know in our lives is that people don't identify their experiences as having been traumatic. Like it can be traumatic for a child to move to a new city. It can be changing schools. It can be moving to a different house in the same neighborhood. It doesn't mean someone abused you or mistreated you deliberately, but it could still have been traumatic for you as a child. And there are so many, if we really opened up the definition more broadly to what children actually experience as being traumatic, situations where they felt helpless and they felt alone and scared and they didn't feel like anyone could help them. That's a lot of things because children are powerless by being children.
Well, it's pretty much everything. But I guess, it is potentially everything. I guess one of the ways that I look at things, which may be a little bit different, is that the way I work is that I come from a perspective of suggesting that, so trauma would be a result of kind of stress and emotion. My perspective is that, well, it's not that external events as such cause our emotional triggers. Our emotion arises inside of us. And so this is why I don't think necessarily we can look at events. And if people say, well, my life wasn't traumatic, well, it's not necessarily about that. It's about the way you unconsciously responded to that to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And it's about your natural wiring. Now, obviously, I have to be very careful because, there's something can be something of a fine line between empowerment and blame. And my work is about being empowered and saying, all right, well, yes, if my emotions arise from inside of me, if I'm creating them as opposed to them being triggered, let me look at how I can more effectively process them for my benefit, rather than, oh my God, you saying this is my fault, which is obviously the blame side. So I try to steer clear of that. But I think, I think it's, my sense generally is we're a little bit too externalized in our culture. And I think that's why we're seeing so much more chronic health, so many more chronic health problems across the scale, really. There is this focus on what's going on outside of me. And I think one of the things that we need to do is bring it back to what's going on inside of me. I know I've gone off at a bit of a tangent there. So bring me back.
No, not at all. But let's take it back to that empowering stance that you have. Your book is called The Intelligent Body, and it's the idea that your body can heal from the inside out. So why don't you talk with us and let our listeners know about how you work with the body and help your clients, the people you coach and work with, to heal their symptoms or their chronic illnesses and chronic pain with your work?
I guess there's a number of probably important pieces. So we talked about symptoms, and we talked about how symptoms can get worse, and from what we were just saying about trauma. And what I've experienced is that people's symptoms do get worse, and they come and go. So everybody that I've worked with something chronic, be it fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, IBS, it always starts with something milder earlier in life. And, which could be a bit of anxiety, a bit of depression, insomnia, headaches, bad stomach, these sorts of things. And then or bad back, chest pains, these sorts. And what happens is that either those symptoms subside, or people do some work to try to alleviate those symptoms, but the symptoms come back. Now, my perspective, as I was saying earlier, with the idea of emotion being a non-conscious process and our body using emotion as a way of getting our attention, my sense is that, okay, well, we could look at it in a metaphorical way, that your body, everything you feel is your body trying to give you some feedback, your body trying to get your attention. So be it hunger or be it a bad head. And what we need to do is actually pay attention to that. So my sense is that if we are blocking our emotional feelings, the body starts to use symptoms as a way of getting our attention. And it will effectively increase the volume or intensity of those symptoms if we don't pay attention to them. And I think people intuitively sort of know this. Is that kind of thing that if somebody has had a particularly overwhelming or frustrating day at work, at the office, and they come home with a bad head, I think people often know that they've got a bad head. They've got this headache because of it's been a particularly frustrating or anger-provoking day at the office. And but however, I think if that headache were to go on for say 2 weeks, I think that intuitive sense of, well, it's actually still because I haven't dealt with my feelings and that situation. They'd probably go to their doctor, who would give them some meds, And if that continued, they'd probably have some tests, and it would look at the symptoms. And I think people forget that they probably, intuitively have a sense of those symptoms are actually trying to tell them something. So that's the first bit, which I think is the very idea that the body is increasing the volume of symptoms. That doesn't mean that the message behind the symptoms is any different. So if it's still about blocked emotion, the message is the same. I think that, again, sort of unconsciously, we have a sense that if I'm getting very big symptoms, there must be a very big problem requiring a very big solution, which in my experience is not the case. It's the message, which is in most instances, a blockage of my emotional flow, is that's the same regardless of whether the symptoms are mild or the symptoms are severe. So that's the first piece, and I look at it in a very simple way. That the body acts with a sense of immediacy, and obviously, like the person having a headache at the end of the workday, which might kick off around lunchtime, if it's been a bad meeting, the body responds quite quickly. If we are blocking our emotional feelings, there's every chance that the body will respond quite quickly with symptoms. And what happens is that once the body gets to producing symptoms, it gets there quicker next time. And of course, we know our bodies work like this with everything. It's like if you're a sports person and you attain a certain level of fitness that takes you 6 months to get there, if you drop off your training for a while and then go back, you'll get back to that level of fitness much quicker the second time round. So that can serve us in some aspects, but the same principle, I believe, is at work with symptoms. So if you're a person that experiences, say, anxiety symptoms, it may have taken quite a buildup of things in your stress bucket to begin with before your body started to send those anxiety symptoms. But once you've had them, the chances are it'll get there quicker next time, which I guess means that you've got to pay attention. So that's the sort of the first bit, really, is that idea that, okay, well, what we're going to do is interpret our symptoms from the perspective that they may be a block of the flow of my emotional flow or the flow of me. So again, the sort of slightly esoteric bit of that is I think there is an energy, a consciousness that is us. So I talk about it being in the book about it being our true self. And I'm not trying to define our true self other than it being probably something far greater than we currently conceive of. But when that true self is blocked, our emotion gets blocked, and then the body presents symptoms. So a huge part of the work is really getting people back in touch with that true self, and I do that through feeling, and it's translating symptoms into feelings essentially, and that really is a paradigm shift for lots of people. So you talked about people with having patients of yours with IBS. The majority of people think that IBS is about their diet and about things that they're eating. But I've had lots of clients where when they're okay, they can almost eat what they like. But when things are bad, a glass of water could trigger IBS symptoms for them. And of course, and this is it, isn't it? This is what we do as humans, is that we work in the opposite way of science. We form beliefs quite quickly on a small amount of evidence, and then we look out into the world and we filter everything else out that doesn't conform with our beliefs. And we're not consciously doing that, but that's what happens. Unfortunately, what happens is that people, everyone that I work with, and I'm sure this may be the case for you as well, is that they have their ideas, their kind of preconceived ideas about what causes their symptoms. And certainly with IBS, it's, well, because if I've eaten this or I've eaten that. So then to say, and of course, cause and effect are quite closely linked there. It makes sense. Well, if I've got a problem with my gut, it makes sense that it's something that I'm putting in there. The idea that it's some emotional stress that is built up in my stress bucket actually shift cause and effect a little bit further apart. But it's a little bit of you have to that's, you have to be open to the fact that your original theory, your original belief might be wrong. And that can take a little bit of time for people. So some people get that straight away, and they're very open to the fact that, well, yeah, actually, the way I've been thinking is probably not right, and they can get that notion that, okay, well, there may be some feelings that I'm not aware of underneath those symptoms. And again, that's why that Antonio Damasio idea of emotion and feeling being different is so important. Because again, lots of people will say, yeah, but I can feel my feelings, and I'd say, well, there probably are some that you are aware of, but the fact you're having symptoms would suggest that there are emotions under the surface, and the feelings associated with those emotions are being blocked, and that's why your body is sending symptoms instead. So what we have to do is kind of assume that there are emotions underneath those symptoms. So that's, I guess in a nutshell, that's the sort of the start of how the work begins to unfold. And then I guess it gets deeper from there, really.
Yeah. So thank you for all of that background. And you have pretty clear examples, some actual exercises and case examples in your book to help people realize how they can work to move through those emotional blockages and get more connected with their true self. I think we could have a whole second discussion just about that. If you wanted to, I would love to have you back to talk about that, because, I think that so often on this podcast, I'm helping people learn more about something, but then they're like, but how? How do you do it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one thing I try to do in the book. And I'm not, for a second, because I got accused of this last week, which I thought was ridiculous because I'd never actually said it. But I'm not suggesting that people can get well by reading the book.
Right.
But I do lay out up to the point, this process is evolving all of the time as everything should, really. But when I wrote this, I basically put everything in there. So everything that I was using with my clients, everything that I'd worked up with my colleagues went into the book. And I would hope that there are people that can take themselves through that and derive some benefit from it. But yeah, I'm not suggesting that people can get completely well by reading a book. But it's pretty much all there.
Yeah. And I think that for me, I can read a book and I can, try some techniques, and it can be very helpful and help me understand where I want to go from there. And then, the work with someone is what really takes it deeper. And to that end, who do you work with and where? Like, do you only work with people directly in Wales?
I don't. No, I work, probably 70% of my clients are in the US. So I do a lot of work via Skype. I have a colleague in West Wales. I have a colleague who does this work in Arlington, Virginia. My intention is to start training practitioners in this work, and I'm hoping that we can set up a first training maybe next March or April, which will be in the US. The intention is to have that in Washington, D.C., if all goes according to plan.
How wonderful. Yeah, I'm only an hour away from there. That's exciting to hear.
So that's the plan. But yeah, I've worked with, I guess I spent the last 15 years really working with people all over the planet, really. That's the joy of Skype. And I guess because this is I'm not really doing anything to people. It's sort of a teaching process, really. My job is to be the advocate for the intelligent body, really. I'm trying to get people to reconnect with their true self. And when they do, and they begin to, when they can see symptoms from this different perspective, they can begin to feel again, so they can reawaken their emotional feelings, get more aligned with their true self. They begin to notice that it's that idea that, well, if I'm processing my emotion, my emotional feelings, my body doesn't need to send symptoms. The only reason my body sends symptoms is because the emotions have been stuck in my stress bucket. So it's a very simple idea, but it's, that's what I guess that's what I'm trying to teach through this work.
Well, I think your book is amazing, and I'm sure that many people who are listening are not only going to want to go get the book, but also get in touch with you and possibly, do some Skype sessions with you. So how can people find you and your book?
The book is available hopefully through all good retailers, certainly on Barnes & Noble and Amazon. And you can get it as an audiobook, as a Kindle, and it's a hardback. I'm knocking it there. And you can get hold. I'm on Facebook and social media and all that kind of stuff. I have, if you're on Facebook and you do get pain and fatigue symptoms, I have a group called the Fatigue and Pain Solutions Group, and I have been up to this point doing weekly live broadcasts where I kind of deal with questions from people and talk for half an hour, ramble for half an hour about them. My website is energyflowcoaching.com, and you can find out a little bit more about us there.
Great. I will put all of that in the show notes so people can get right to you from this episode. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. Today is part 2 of my interview with Kyle Davies, the author of The Intelligent Body, Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out. Kyle, thanks for coming back to Therapy Chat today.
I'm so excited about being back. It's brilliant. I just hope that I don't repeat what I said in the first episode. But I'm sure you'll keep me on track. Just in case I do, you can slap me around a bit.
Non-violence only over here, but I will definitely help you remember what we wanted to talk about. But yeah, so in the first interview we had, which aired just a couple weeks ago, we talked about your book and all of the things that can be going on in the body to cause chronic fatigue and pain and sort of how those processes work. So let's kind of pick up where we were and start off with talking about how emotions play a part in that.
Emotions. Oh, it's a big word, emotions. It means so much to so many people, doesn't it? And there seem to be countless theories of what it's all about. And my sense of it, most people think that emotion is a mental process. You think some thoughts, you have some emotions, and if you want to change the way you feel, you change the way you think. And my work really kind of goes against that. It sort of struck me when I wrote the book and I looked into some of the theories of emotion. A lot of them were kind of trying to explain what's going on inside. And there didn't seem to be a great deal that was looking at the role that emotion plays in health. Now, I would have to admit, I'm probably not completely up to speed with all the academic research that's taking place at the moment, but there didn't seem to be a great deal to me. So I think through my practice and working with people and my own intuitive feelings on it, what I've written in the book is my own little take on what emotion is. And I've borrowed ideas from here and there as well. But it strikes me that emotion is a complex physiological process that is affecting sort of all of the body and all of the brain, certainly the major organs of the body. And we know that the gut and the heart and the non-thinking part of the brain play a huge role, and that our emotional processing occurs at far higher speeds than our cognitive processing. So whilst the majority of strategies to try to change one's emotion involve thinking, that to me seems somewhat futile if our emotion is affecting our thinking. So my sense of it is that there's kind of a few things that affect our emotion. One of them really is that the idea that our emotion arises inside of us. I think an awful lot of the time people think that emotion is triggered by some external event. And my approach is more in alignment with the idea that our emotion is somehow bubbling up from inside. And following the work of Antonio Damasio, he talks about emotion as being a non-conscious process. I can't remember whether I talked about this last time, but
you did touch on it, but I think it's great to review because it's really so complicated and kind of can be hard to understand. So this is a good explanation to go more in depth with. So thank you. Please keep going.
So his idea is that there are different brain structures involved in the production of emotion and then feelings, with the idea being that emotions are supposed to trigger feelings, and obviously they happen simultaneously almost. And what we know is that we can block our emotional feelings, but which means obviously we don't feel, but that doesn't mean that our emotion stops. Our emotion is still bubbling away underneath, and therefore is affecting the brain, affecting the body. And ultimately, from my perspective and the perspective of people experiencing symptoms of one sort or another, the fact that emotion is still being produced, it backs up, it builds up, it gets blocked, and then that leads to a rewiring of the emotional midbrain. So I think that for me, emotion, the idea that my emotion is arising inside of me is useful. And there's two sort of idiosyncratic approaches I take. One is that in terms of being empowered and looking at emotion in useful ways, I tend to talk about emotion as being a feedback mechanism which my body is sending me as a result of my interaction with my environment. Now, I also talk in the book about this slightly nebulous idea about a true self, which is a quasi-spiritual notion that there is this energy, this consciousness that flows through us. And we don't necessarily have to define it, but there is this deeper true self that is within us. So I look at emotion as being feedback about our interaction with our environment, inviting us to align with our true self. And I look at our intuitive feelings, things like realizations, inner knowings, little gentle nudges, epiphanies, those things as being direct communication from our true self. And then our emotion as being a little tap on the shoulder to remind us that we need, if we can, to act in alignment with that true self. And a lot of my work is focused on being empowered. And the idea of that is, rather than looking at my emotions being triggered by something outside of me, and then me frantically trying to change something outside of me or blaming something outside of me, if I can look at my emotion as arising from inside of me as maybe an indication that I might either be deviating from my true self, or that I simply need to align my actions or my words with my true self. By taking away the judgment of external circumstances, it reduces our suffering hugely. My sense of it is, we're designed to experience all of our feelings, and as long as we allow them, they can flow through us. But frequently what we do is we automatically kind of resist them or block them because we think we're going to drown in them, or we think they are who we are, or we're frantically trying to fix outside life, and we're judging outside life. We often judge life and we judge ourselves, and that puts a layer of what I see as suffering on top of whatever emotion I might be feeling. So if I'm in the workplace and my boss is doing something that I don't like, and I'm allowing it to happen, and my body, should we say, sends me the emotion of anger, I would say that, well, my body is inviting me to align with my true self and act in an authentic way in that context, rather than saying my boss makes me angry, because that judgment will really add a layer of, in inverted commas, suffering to the emotion that I'm experiencing. So that's my kind of sense of what emotion is. It's that, it's a simple idea really, that it's feedback about our interaction with our environment. But I guess what I try to do with my work is have people focus on the emotion that they're experiencing now. So, borrowing from the idea of Candice Pert, she talked about our emotion as being sort of no different from feelings of hunger or feelings of tiredness. They're just feedback mechanisms. So I tend to look at, with my clients, tend to look at emotion as being something that is happening now. And because many of the people I work with are not really feeling their emotions because they've learned to block their feelings, their body is then sending symptoms. So I'm translating symptoms back into what the emotions would be underneath. And I'm doing that in the present moment. So if a person, has an increase in symptoms of pain or fatigue or stomach or bowel, upset at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, I'm translating it back to emotion that is present in their body that they're not feeling at 2:30, on that Thursday afternoon. And it's making it very much about now. And it can be that there is something that connects to things in the past, as it usually does. History repeats itself, and it's very often the case that the pattern of blocking emotion, certainly around particular contexts or with certain people, we will usually have started early in childhood. But my focus for the most part is understanding those patterns, but then looking at what somebody can do now. So it's the idea that emotion is about now. And from that perspective, I don't try to change people's thinking. It's just, going back to what I was saying earlier, the idea that, well, our emotion, I don't believe that we can, in this moment, we can control the emotion that we have. And I think that those self-help ideas that are about completely taking charge and control of your emotion are misguided. I don't think we necessarily can control the emotional feelings that we have in this moment. I think we can take steps to affect the direction of our emotion into the future by where we place our attention. I think our behavior, our words, our thoughts, our actions today affects the emotion that we can potentially experience tomorrow and the day after and the day after. But in this moment now, I don't think I can control the emotional experience that I have. And allowing it to flow is far better, I think, than just trying to change it. It's interesting to me. I think we would remove an entire layer of suffering if we allowed ourselves to suffer a little. So if we almost embraced the emotional feelings that we had without believing that it's me, without believing that I'm going to drown in it, with a sense of knowing that it's part of my experience. It will flow through me if I allow it. Maybe I need to take action on it. It may be that I just need to feel it. If we can do that and we can allow it to flow, knowing that arises inside of me without having to fix the environment around me, I think we remove an entire layer of suffering. My sense of it is, for the most part, people we're driven to alleviate our internal discomfort. And I think in doing that, because almost everybody believes that their feeling experience is directly caused by an external event, people are almost automatically, frantically trying to fix their environment in order to fix their feelings. And if they can turn that around and believe that, yes, there's going to be this energy within the environment. I can't extricate myself from the environment entirely. However, if I can believe and feel into the notion that my emotional experience is arising inside of me, and it will fluctuate, moods change. So I don't always have the same emotional experience or the same feeling experience to the same external event. So knowing that and knowing that it arises inside of me means I don't have to frantically fix life outside of me. And that means, I can allow myself to feel what I feel. I can believe that everything I feel is all right. So I'm accepting myself. My emotion is not a problem and doesn't need to be fixed or solved. It's just feedback. And I think the more we can do that, the more our resulting behavior is constructive and the less we will suffer, if that makes sense. I'm covering a lot of stuff there quite quickly, aren't I? I hope I'm not rambling too much.
No, that was really fascinating, I thought. And I was thinking a ton while you were talking. One thing I would like to say is that the idea that changing your thinking is a solution. I hear from so many people who they come to therapy and they're disgusted with themselves because they can't change the way they think. And they're saying, I know I shouldn't think this way. I know I should just tell myself not to do that. And, it's like that reveals the limitation of the changing your thinking. Yeah,
it doesn't work, does it? Really?
Right.
I mean, it's interesting actually. Just on that point. So I've got a client at the moment who's going through divorce, and her first session, we were talking about essentially the massive layer of suffering she was experiencing because she was trying to normalize the emotions that she was having. And because, as I was saying earlier, our emotion will flood through and affect our thinking. As soon as emotion is present in the body and the brain, our thinking centers light up. So thinking begins, and which is understandable, really. But I think, back in the olden days when we were probably living in tribes in the jungle being chased by bears, having emotion and then thinking is you're quickly thinking about how to escape. But I think the types of the mind loops that we seem to have evolved into is where we're trying to find meaning or analyze the emotions that we're feeling. We're trying to solve them, or this sort of stuff, rather than looking for actions to take. So people get caught up in these really destructive mind loops. So she was thinking a lot, trying to justify and qualify and normalize her feeling experience, even talking to people about, is it okay for me to feel this? Should I feel this? Should I be feeling something else? So coming back to what I was saying, earlier, the simple idea of allowing everything you feel to be okay, believing that what I feel is not a problem and what I feel doesn't need to be solved. It may be that what I feel is trying to give me a nudge to take some action out there in life, but what I feel in and of itself does not need to be solved. When we can be in that space, all of that suffering goes, but it also reduces the amount of mental chatter that we have. I think because of Facebook and social media and all this kind of stuff, we are far too externally referenced in my view, and I think it's a huge cause of lots of problems. I think certainly the people I work with anxiety more than anything else, the external reference far outweighs their internal reference. So they're always looking at trying to match themselves to some version of how they should be in the world. And of course, we're constantly getting this feedback from media about kind of how we should be. And that massive deviation from true self, ultimately, the body then tries to give us a nudge to say, you're deviating from your true self here. So I'm going to send you some symptoms, possibly anxiety symptoms, to try to bring you back on track. And of course, what I experience is people think that the symptoms are bad and evil, that they just want to lance like a boil. Whereas really, from my perspective, symptoms are always just a tap on the shoulder. So if it's anxiety symptoms, it's very often that there's a massive external reference. Somebody's wearing a mask. Somebody's trying to fit in, to do the right thing, to people please. And in doing so, losing the essence of themselves, losing their connection with their true self. So I think, it's... And again, that idea that if emotion does affect thinking, which is what I find, is if we come back and deal with our emotion, my belief is that thinking takes care of itself. But if we try to, because I started my career, I had a very cognitive approach, and I spent a long time trying to battle people's thinking and have them, write out lists of positive things, moving their pictures and words around in their head and all this kind of stuff. And whilst there may be some temporary relief, it's in the kind of slightly medium or longer term, it's a lot of hard work to do that. And thinking seems to lead to more thinking in my experience. So you have to kind of keep applying these mental techniques to give you a little bit of relief. And I believe ultimately, if we really want to make a step change and experience our potential, we have to tap into our true self. I think those times when people are successful, when they're happy, the best times in their lives are when they're in they're in a state of flow, when they're connected to their true self. They're not in their head. So I think that by training ourselves to be in our head with mental techniques tends to keep us in our head and prevents us from really accessing the fullness of who we can be. So I tend to avoid those mind-based techniques. Whilst I do acknowledge that in the short term, if you're having lots of dysfunctional thoughts, that it can help alleviate in the short term, but as a long-term strategy, I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, I mean, our cognition serves a purpose, but it may not be I kind of feel that the whole change your thoughts idea is really just telling you to suppress your reactions to your emotions, which again, that's just that it sort of is repeating that cycle that you're talking about, that you don't know what you feel, so you're blocking your feelings, and then thus you end up reacting to them anyway and not even knowing what you're reacting to.
Absolutely.
So going into that, talking about symptoms, you said that in your book, you say symptoms are solutions, and you talk about symptoms as stuck energy. Can you explain a little more about that and how you work with that stuck energy?
So going back to what I was saying a couple of minutes ago, I always look at symptoms rather than being some evil invader that's trying to crush our lives. If we look at it as my body is sending me some feedback, so I just need to pay attention, it puts an entirely different slant on it. If I'm going out for a walk with my wife and a stone goes in my shoe, I feel a sharp pain in my foot. And of course, that pain is useful, isn't it? If I don't feel that pain, then that stone will penetrate my skin, could get infected, could get gangrene, and have to have my leg taken off. And that's a bit extreme.
That could happen.
That would be incredibly unlucky, wouldn't it? Though.
Yeah.
But we at that level we intrinsically know that pain is serving us a purpose. I look at symptoms as all symptoms in the same way. When we come to the conditions that I work with, anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, pain, fibromyalgia, those sorts of things, I'm looking at symptoms as being a blockage of our emotional energy and really a deviation from our true self. So I guess what I'm saying is that when we deviate from our true self, we get feedback in the form of emotion. If we've learned to block our feelings, then we don't feel our emotions, so it gets stuck. In terms of how do I unblock that, it is about looking at what is taking place in the present. So, the little example I used earlier, if somebody's in Starbucks at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon and they have an increase in symptoms of some sort, could be anxiety, it could be a headache, then I would say around that time, it could be right there in that moment. It could be that afternoon. It could be something potentially that's happened that morning. There's something where some emotion would have been blocked, or there is a deviation, a significant deviation from true self. And the way I work with it is by identifying when there are increases in symptoms, we begin to see patterns. And what I find is everybody has their own patterns, and patterns connect to kind of deeper issues for the person, which is I kind of blandly refer to as life lessons, just because history repeats itself for most people. And it for example, it could be that there is a person with boundary issues. Means in this context could mean that they're often taken advantage of or treated badly. And that could be one of their patterns. And what we would then find is that symptoms would very often crop up around times where they'd been taken advantage of, or somebody had been nasty to them or mean to them. And very often these things are quite subtle. And what happens is that in those instances, because the person is used to behaving in a particular way, the emotion that the body would send is not felt. So the body is cranking up the volume to try to get the person's attention and sending symptoms instead. Of course, what most people do is they focus on the symptom with an eye to how can I get rid of this symptom by working on the symptom, rather than the symptom is my body trying to tell me that there's some emotion blocked here, or I'm not being true to myself here. Let me have a look at what's going on. And if I've been working with that person and we've identified that boundaries is an issue for them, we could be looking at, okay, so what happened in Starbucks, on that Thursday afternoon? And it could very often it's very small things. I think life is made up of a series of moments, and in each moment, something small is happening. It could well be that person in Starbucks was given the incorrect change and has spotted in their hands that they gave $20 for a $2 coffee, and they were given sort of $3 change, and they kind of walk away, and there's a frustration that they don't really feel, and all of a sudden they're sat drinking their coffee and they have a headache that starts to come on. And probably what they would then do is blame the caffeine or something, or maybe I didn't get enough sleep last night, or maybe I'm not hydrated enough. These are the sorts of things that I tend to find is people are looking for something which is kind of obvious. And I suppose one of the tricky things about my work is that cause and effect may seem a little bit far apart. So the fact that the barista in Starbucks has possibly incorrectly given me the wrong change, there's frustration which I've not let myself feel, and then that's my body's letting me know that by then sending me this headache. That's cause and effect seem a little bit far away, but people are used to thinking, oh, if I got a bad head, it's caffeine or water or whatever. So that is the simple way that I work. It becomes a little bit more complex because sometimes it gets deeper into the person's relationship with themselves. If we're looking at a deviation from true self, so a person is not connected to their true self, then there'll be reasons for that, and having them reconnect that can be something of a process, because they have to learn to trust themselves. They have to learn to see themselves as worthy and worthwhile. They have to really learn to love themselves to a certain extent. So, but that can all happen. But does that make sense in terms of looking at how we unblock that emotional blockage?
Yeah. And do you want to say anything about specifically how you actually unblock it? Like what in the work that you do makes that happen, or is that too much?
Okay, so no, it isn't. It would be a series of. If I give a couple of examples, it would be a series of things. So the way I start working with people is I have them identify when they're having increases in symptoms. That Starbucks example is a genuine one, and I would suggest that as a behavioural piece, which part of the work is behaviourally focused, I would invite that person to begin with. It's recognizing, when they begin to they can begin to recognize that, okay, well, if I'm getting if I'm getting a headache, I've obviously missed some emotions. All right, so what's going on here? And it's okay. Well, if I'm honest with myself, my body is probably frustrated that I've been shortchanged, quite literally here. All right, well, I'll go back up and I'll talk to the guy behind the counter there and tell him. So that would be that's taking a constructive action on the emotion that was there. So it could be, to begin with, that it is looking at something behavioral. If my body's trying to give me a shove in a particular direction, it could also be. So I've got a client at the moment, and I think there are definite issues about loving himself. So he tends to find that he constantly tries to fix things for people. He's constantly trying to help other people out. And it's all driven by the fact that he's very concerned about how other people perceive him. So he's looking to be validated from the outside. What I need for him to learn to do is to be validating himself. So there's a combination of behavioral things that he will stop doing and start doing. And there may be some little exercises, some guided feeling exercises that I would have him do, where he can allow himself to begin to feel and create feelings of love and joy for himself. So it's a bit of a process, really. I don't have a step-by-step sequence of doing things. But I guess the biggest thing is trying to break patterns and have people reconnect with their true self. So in the book, what I've done is I've highlighted a whole series of examples of exercises that I might invite people to do. And all of the exercises are really meant as gentle nudges. They're not meant as strict absolute techniques that somebody must apply. They're just gentle nudges to get people to break patterns that may not be useful for them and to begin to develop that trust of true self, which is really trusting their deeper feelings, trusting that intuitive wisdom that is there within all of us.
Yeah, so true. That resonates so much. And I think, when we ask ourselves, what do I want, or how do I feel right now? The answer is always there, but it's just getting through those layers of things that we're doing to block connection with ourselves.
I think it's absolutely true. I think for the most part, we're such an intellectually focused set of cultures that we're disconnected from our feeling experience, or much of it. So, I try to get people back in touch with their physical body, with the idea that there's a wisdom in the body. And if you bring your attention into your body as you're going about your day-to-day life, and I don't mean forcing yourself in, just again, a gentle nudge, because, as I'm walking down the street, there'll be times when I'm aware of my body and times when I may be daydreaming. I don't want to force myself in a kind of a mindfulness kind of way where it's an absolute technique. But if I can develop a little bit more presence and with a knowledge that there is this kind of innate wisdom within me that is my true self, then I can sense when I'm having a nudge or a push or an intuitive feeling, and allow myself to pay attention to that. I think, again, to say, as a culture, we just don't teach people to do that. We teach people to think their way through everything. But my sense of it is that we don't get back to that true self by thinking. I think my sense is it's an absence of thinking that allows us to reconnect. And, then it's almost like there's a flow that comes through us. My first sort of realizations of this for myself were in my early 20s. And this may sound a bit weird, but it felt almost like there was a cord of energy that moved through me, came through my back and out of my chest and kind of pulled me along. So my early 20s was a time of lots of anxiety and bouts of depression. And I analysed absolutely everything. And I think spending 5 years at university probably didn't help, because I analysed life, I analysed myself, I analysed everything I did. I lived in my head and I was deeply miserable. And I then began to get this sense of almost like a consciousness or energy that just pulling me. And my head had become so cluttered that I felt like I'd almost reached a rock bottom where I just couldn't analyse anymore. And there was a surrender, I suppose, a letting go. And it was that from a place of, I just can't figure anything out. I can't decide on anything. So I'm just going to kind of let go. And when I did that, I said I had this feeling, almost like this big cord of energy coming out of my chest, pulling me along. And that was, I think, the wisdom of the body, the intuitive true self, which was guiding me. And I think everyone can get back in touch with that. And I don't think you have to reach rock bottom to get there. It's just about spending a little bit more time being present in the body with a knowledge that that energy is there, that consciousness is there, that true self is going to guide you. But normally what happens is that the chattering monkey in the head just is way louder. So we're so busy in our head thinking about the next 6 things that we have to do that all that noise, and the kind of white noise as well on the periphery of our consciousness, that tends to just drown out the intuitive feelings that we have. But it's there. It's all there underneath.
Yeah. And you just touched on something that I was going to ask you about in the book. One of the last chapters, possibly the last chapter, is called Human Needs and Tapping Your Creative Flow. And I think, there are a lot of people who are talking about getting into your flow, but then there are a lot of people who've never heard about it. So I would love if you could talk more about that.
So there's a thing called flow state, and from my understanding of it, the idea of flow state is it's like a peak experience. So people that have talked about it often refer to kind of top athletes or people that may be engaged in dangerous sports, and there is this peak point where the level of arousal is reasonably high. Cognition is probably drops off a bit, but they're in this flow and their performance is particularly high. I'm modifying that notion with the idea within the idea of energy flow coaching to it being us just being in our own flow. So when I talked about that cord of energy extending through me and me just feeling pulled, that wasn't a peak experience for me. I wasn't necessarily performing at my best, but I was in my own flow. So it's that idea really that we can be a flow, and if we pay attention to the feeling feedback that we have, and we allow ourselves to believe that, well, if my body feels uncomfortable, it may be that I'm moving away from my own flow. So let me just, rather than ignoring that, maybe I can pay attention to that and I can nudge myself back into my own flow. So the idea of energy flow is being aligned with our emotional feelings and our intuitive feelings and allowing ourselves almost to be pulled along by this intuitive wisdom in the body, that's true self-wisdom.
Great explanation. So I know when there have been times where I've felt like I was in that state of flow, it's like it's a difference between things feeling so hard and trying to figure out what you're supposed to do and how to do it or whatever. It's just happening, and it's so easy and it's so natural, and it's just like, and you're feeling like, yeah, this is okay. If you're creating something, or if you're into what you're doing and it's just flowing naturally versus, well, what do I do here? How do I do this? What's next? And that more like thinking, really controlled.
Yeah, I think that's sort of spot on, really. My sense is that when we begin to experience discomfort, it's often because we are trying to figure out everything in our thinking brain, and then we set up how things should be, how things should happen, when it should happen. And we're trying to drag ourselves along because the thinking brain has decided this is what should happen. And if that runs counter to the flow of our emotional and intuitive feelings, then what we get is this internal tension. And normally what happens is people try to push through and decide, oh no, this is, I've got this goal in my head, and this is what I have to achieve, or this is what I have to do. And my sense of it is, well, in the short term that might be all right, but I don't think it's a particularly useful or a particularly comfortable way of living. I think it's better to, and I think we can spend more time experiencing our own flow by allowing ourselves to believe that, well, if I'm feeling tension in my body, there's every chance that what my thinking brain has set up, has decided should happen, may not be really deep down what I want, or the way I want to do it, or the timeline that I want to do it on. So by then coming back and trusting the wisdom of the body and going with that, we can get back into that flow.
That's beautiful. And, I was just thinking about people saying, oh, you can't just do whatever you want. You can't just follow whatever feels right. You have to do what you're supposed to do. Things would be out of control. It'd be lawlessness. And it's like, I don't think our real true self is telling people to do things that harm other people or anything like that. It's more connected. I think it's more connecting. So if everyone was really operating from that place, probably it would be a lot kinder. There'd be less violence,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like it wouldn't be like just like, a free for all. Well, what I want is this. So I'm going to take from you and hurt you and stuff.
I think this is, and I'm going back to what I was saying earlier. I think much of our behavior is driven to try to get away from internal discomfort. And I think a lot of destructive behavior stems from that space where people believe that life outside of them is directly causing how they feel. So they have to change something out in life in order to feel different. And I think that is a major cause of bad behavior. If I can, if I walk into the bathroom and my wife has squeezed the toothpaste tube from the middle and I feel a huge amount of rage, that rage says more about my state of consciousness in that moment than it does about the toothpaste tube, because there will be probably 8 out of 10 times I'll walk into the bathroom and she's done the same thing, and I will just kind of smile and squeeze from the bottom and even out the toothpaste in the tube, But I think that, what people too frequently do is see that toothpaste tube, feel the feelings, believe that the toothpaste is causing them to feel like that, and then they behave in a destructive way. Whereas being in that space of recognizing, well, my state of consciousness exists on a spectrum, which I've highlighted a couple of times in the book, and there are times when I feel connected to my true self, and therefore I feel rosy and happy and all life is good. And there are times when I'm a little bit more disconnected, feel a bit off kilter. And when I feel a bit off kilter like that, my perception of life is a little bit more negative or hostile. My perception of myself is not so good, and I'm more emotionally reactive. Simply knowing that, I think, is incredibly useful, because, as I say, then if I have a large amount of negative emotion, rather than blaming what's going on outside, I can look and say, well, actually, it's just my state of consciousness in this moment. And I know that my natural blueprint, my natural template wants to pull me back into flow, wants to pull me back up to the higher consciousness end of the spectrum. And if I react and if I believe that the toothpaste tube is causing my anger, it's just going to keep me locked in a low consciousness space. And I think we have a lot of that. I think we have a lot of people, people who behave in a destructive and aggressive and angry manner. They're operating from low consciousness because they're living in perpetual fear and anger. And they're trying desperately to fix it, but they're trying to fix it in a destructive way. And by doing that, they're keeping themselves locked in a low consciousness space. So if only they knew this, that actually it's not that life is making me like this, it's what I'm doing, it's keeping me locked down there. If I just let myself feel, I'll naturally gravitate back up towards the higher consciousness flow end of the spectrum.
Oh, what a wonderful way to finish this conversation. I love that. Thank you so much. So Kyle, so I know we talked in the first episode that we did together about how just reading a book isn't going to be the answer to everything, but tell people how, for anyone who might have missed the first interview, I'll direct them back to part 1, but let's tell them how they can find you, more of what you're doing, and possibly do energy flow coaching with you.
So the book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and high street retailers. It's on Kindle, it's on audiobook, The Intelligent Body. You can find me on 2 websites, kyledavies.net and also on energyflowcoaching.com. I work with individuals, with organizations on a range of things, from people that are chronically ill with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, anxiety, depression, through to people that just feel a bit stuck, or they want to improve their performance. They want to be, better employees, better managers, better husbands. So please do get in touch with me and see if I can help you.
I'm sure many people are going to want to, because people do listen to this from all over the world, and you're in Wales, but you can work with people anywhere.
I do, yeah. I would say 60% of my clients are US based, interestingly. So I do a lot of work via Skype. So yes, I'm amenable to all over the world.
Wonderful. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for coming back to Therapy Chat and sharing your wisdom with us. I think that this was a really fascinating conversation, and I think it's going to help a lot of people. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much to you as well, Laura. I look forward to being invited back for a third time.
Hey, I can totally see that happening.
Just another reminder that if you'd like to become a member of Therapy Chat, supporting the podcast while receiving fun member perks and being able to communicate with me one-on-one, go to patreon.com/therapychat. If every subscriber donated just $1 per month, Therapy Chat would be able to keep going strong indefinitely. Thanks so much for your support.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, LCSWC. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.